Welcome to the Marist College Library and Archives and Special Collections. During this brief talk, you'll learn the differences between primary and secondary sources and also where you can find them. First, let's start with a few definitions. Primary sources express a first-hand experience, impression, or idea. Secondary sources interpret and analyze primary sources. We'll be using some examples from our special collections, but everything that's discussed will apply to general research using primary and secondary sources. So let's expand a bit on the definition of a primary source. A primary source is an original object or document and provides first-hand information. A primary source is material written or produced in the time period that you may be investigating. Primary sources enable the researcher to get as close as possible to what actually happened during an historical event or time period. Primary sources can come in a variety of formats, such as letters, diaries, official documents, or interviews. The collection of materials you see here are from our Lowell Thomas papers. Personal diaries and journals are examples of a primary source. Keep in mind that all sources, not just primary sources, contain some sort of bias depending on the person's background or agenda. Some are easier to detect than others. For example, one of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's speeches may have been trying to sway people to support one of his projects. All politicians do this. However, the bias may not be intentional on the creator's part, but it is important as a researcher to understand the point of view of the person who created the primary source you're interpreting. Here are a couple of primary sources that you can explore. Go ahead and pause the video if you want to explore these websites. An autobiography is a primary source because it is a story about yourself and your experiences. Nelson Mandela wrote his autobiography about the events in his life, and it is called The Long Walk to Freedom. Remember, it is important to use multiple sources in your research. Relying too heavily on any one source will result in unbalanced or even incorrect interpretations and conclusions. Even official documents are considered primary sources as long as they are giving a first-hand account of an event. So again, speeches are considered to be a primary source. A wide range of primary resources can be found online. But keep in mind that only a small percentage of all primary resources have been digitized and made available online. Historical documents such as the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution are primary documents. They're drafted and signed. The following documents are not as exciting to think about as the Declaration of Independence, but they can tell researchers important facts about the past. It was only fairly recently, in the 1970s, that historians really began to accept oral histories as legitimate sources. The concern was that an individual talking about personal experiences too long after an event occurred would not be accurate, or memories would be influenced by more recent events. Ultimately, historians realized that oral histories are very useful resources, especially when used in conjunction with other sources. Senator John McCain's talking about his experiences as a prisoner of war during the Vietnam War, whether he discussed it shortly after he was released or decades later, would be considered primary sources. Sound recordings and interviews can often be useful primary sources. President Franklin Roosevelt's World War II radio addresses are primary sources, as are video interviews given by President Obama in 2008. In case you were wondering, the photo on this slide shows, starting at the top left row, an early computer floppy disk, a standard audio cassette, a 16-inch phonograph record, a wire recording, a quarter-inch open-reel audio tape, a phonograph record, a transcription disc, a dictation loop, a small transcription disc, and an 8-track tape. Other non-print sources, such as photos, can add a lot of useful information to your primary research. Here you see 35mm slides on the left, a proof sheet at the top, and a stack of standard 4x6-inch color prints on the right. Letters are probably one of the first primary source examples people think of. Letters or correspondence can be fun to work with, but it can be challenging to read handwritten materials. Also keep in mind that a primary source doesn't have to be old. If you sent out an email or text today, you created a primary source. The letters on this slide are from T.E. Lawrence to Lowell Thomas. Lawrence was a British military officer, archaeologist, diplomat, and writer. He was best known for his role in the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire during World War I. Thomas was an American newsman who made Lawrence famous as Lawrence of Arabia through his multimedia travelogues. We hold the world's largest collection of Lowell Thomas materials in our archives and special collections. Here's an example of an unusual primary source. Cross-writing was used as a way to save paper, and apparently to give the reader a headache. This letter was written in 1840. The writer wrote the letter from left to right, and then turned the paper 90 degrees and kept writing. The transcription of the letter is on the right. Objects can inform about specific time periods. For example, radios are one of the main forms of entertainment during the Great Depression. Radios influence people's daily lives, so artifacts can be an important complement to text-based primary sources. However, it becomes almost meaningless when taken out of context. It's important to ask the same types of questions as you'd ask when working with other types of primary sources, such as who created the object, did he or she have a particular viewpoint or objective, etc. An artifact provides insight into the customs, preferences, styles, special occasions, work, and play of the culture in which it was created. To find primary sources at Marist, you can go to the Marist College Archives and Special Collections website at library.marist.edu/archives. Exploro is our main database, and it is located on the right of the web page under Research Tools. Exploro has a single search box very much like Google. All the materials on Exploro are fully digitized or full text. You can also find primary sources in the Marist archives using FoxHunt. If you use FoxHunt off the archives website, it has a special filter applied so you only find primary sources. These materials might not be digitized, so you can contact the archives department, get digital versions of items you're interested in using for your research. Contact information can be found on the archives website. So now let's dig a little deeper into secondary sources. Secondary sources interpret and analyze primary sources. They're often removed in space and time from the event they are discussing. Usually the author of a secondary source will have studied the primary sources of an historical period or event and will then interpret the evidence found in these sources. You can think of secondary sources as secondhand information. Think about it like this. If I tell you something, I'm the primary source. If you tell someone else what I told you, you are the secondary source. Secondary source materials can be articles in newspapers, magazines, books, or articles found that analyze, evaluate, or criticize someone else's original research. Almanacs, encyclopedias, history books, textbooks, etc. are all secondary sources because they are written after the events they are describing occurred. A biography is an example of a secondary source. A biography is when you write about another person's life. Alice Fleming wrote a biography on the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This is a secondary document. It was written about him after he died. There are examples of sources that can be primary or secondary depending on how they are used. A collection of Shakespeare's plays could be a primary source if you use them to research what he was doing during specific times in his life. Scholars have done just this type of research. But his plays would be considered secondary resources if you were using them as part of a study on English playwrights. Primary sources can be published or intended for wide audiences. Think about reporters writing articles based on their first-hand experiences of an event. The New York Times dates back to the 1860s when the Civil War was taking place. An article about a reporter's account of the Battle of Antietam is a primary source, even though it was published in a major newspaper. So, why should we use primary sources? Primary sources provide a window into the past, unfiltered access to the record of artistic, social, scientific, and political thought and achievement during the specific time period under study, produced by people who lived during that period. These are unique, often profoundly personal documents and objects can give you a very real sense of what it was like to be alive during a long past era. But there are some disadvantages to using primary sources. For instance, as a researcher, you need to be concerned about the creator's bias, purpose, and point of view. These may challenge students' assumptions concerning the meaning of the primary source. Primary sources are often incomplete and have little context, and researchers must use prior knowledge and work with multiple primary sources to find meaningful patterns. What are the advantages of using secondary sources? Secondary sources can provide analysis, synthesis, interpretation, or evaluation of original information. Secondary sources are best for uncovering background or historical information about a topic and broadening your understanding of a topic by exposing you to others' perspectives, interpretations, and conclusions. They allow the reader to get expert views of events and often bring together multiple primary sources relevant to the subject matter. Again, keep in mind that you need to use multiple sources, primary and secondary, when conducting your research. Your goal is to give the most balanced and unbiased account you possibly can. Of course, there are also some disadvantages of using secondary sources. Their reliability and validity are open to question, and often they do not provide exact or complete information. They do not represent first-hand knowledge of a subject or event. There are countless books, journals, magazine articles, and web pages that attempt to interpret the past, and finding good secondary sources can be an issue. So basically, dealing with the massive amount of information that is available to you can be a challenge. You can find a tremendous range of resources on the web, but remember, the best thing about the internet is that anyone can publish anything they want. And the worst thing about the internet is that anyone can publish anything they want. So when you are on the open web, take a little extra time to make sure your sources come from reputable authors and publishers. You'll find a wide range of primary and secondary sources on the internet, but it is up to you to determine the quality of the resource. We already discussed looking for primary sources using the archives website, and there are additional resources listed on the primary versus secondary resources LibGuide. When you start looking for secondary sources, you should begin with the Marist Libraries database, FoxHunt. You can find a wide variety of secondary sources on the library website. Just go to library.marist.edu to get started. All you need to do is type your keyword search into the search bar and click the search button. Remember, it is up to you to determine the quality of the information you find on the internet. If you use FoxHunt, you know that the sources are coming from reliable publishers. If you use the internet, make sure you can back up why you think you found a good source. Is it from a trusted website or a known scholar? Are there sources listed on the website? Basically, if you're going to use a website in your research, you should find the same characteristics on the website you selected that you find on a scholarly article. Be ready to justify your choice to your professor. If you have questions, don't hesitate to get in touch by email or phone. The archive staff is here to help you succeed in your classes. Thanks for your time.